Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. My name is Alice and I currently work in international climate policy. And as you can imagine, a lot of people might hear that word and think it sounds really fancy, not know what it is. And there are other groups of folks who kind of know what it is and want to get into the space, but don't really know what you actually do day to day and then how do you get into that space and find jobs. So I really wanted to explain a little bit more about what I do and how to get into this space. So after graduating Cornell University, I finished with my environmental science related degree. I also had minors in international development and business. So I decided to go into policy work after attending COP25. COP25 is this United Nations conference that focuses on the Paris Agreement. So it's where all countries come together to discuss on international cooperation and finding agreements to, fight against climate change, whether that's, reducing our greenhouse gas emissions or adapting or working to address loss and damage. Now, if you don't know what these things are, that's fine. I'll put some resources down below from the UNFCCC website. But basically what I do now is related to what I did there. So when I was there, I was really inspired by seeing how everyone came together from the world to work together for this common cause. It was, really rejuvenating because you often find a lot of people who don't really appreciate the importance of the environment. And once you're there, you can really find like-minded individuals, form networks. And I really wanted to help influence the space. So there are a few ways you can start getting into this space. The first is probably working as a government official. So every single party of the United Nations Paris Agreement comes together and negotiates texts. So whether that's negotiating on loss and damage or negotiating on how much finance is going to be mobilized for a certain issue, that sorts of things are negotiated between countries. And so negotiators will come into a room and talk about different texts and different opinions. And one way to do it is based on where you're from, you can then try to apply to your relevant government body that helps negotiate on your country's behalf. So as an example, in the United States, most of the people who negotiate are from State Department, and you can apply through there. There are other ways to apply. For example, I know that in Singapore, as an example, it comes from a number of ministries. It's headed by the NCCS. It's the National Climate Change Secretariat within the Prime Minister's office, and they have other negotiators depending on the expertise of that particular substream. So sometimes you will have Ministry of Finance there, Ministry of Trade and Industry there as well, and they really try to work together. So depending on the specific kind of work you'd like to do and what kind of nationality you have, you can try to apply through government. The second way is through this thing called all the other non-governmental organizations that are there. I currently work for a large NGO, and a large part of what we do is help advise countries or provide technical recommendations as input to the Paris Agreement. So the first part of my job is to provide that technical assistance and ensure that we can push ambition for climate policy forward, but also make sure that it's done in a way that countries are able to do so. So there's one part of development policy, and there's a second part of implementing policy. One great example in the Paris Agreement is Article 6. It talks about carbon markets and trades between different countries. And so some countries may not have an understanding of how to best apply these international schemes into their domestic framework, such that if they were to trade internationally, their domestic framework would fit within the international framework, as an example. So that's a lot of the work I do in terms of more of the technical side. There are NGOs that help on the political side, like trying to influence some of the political disagreements, whether that's on loss and damage or getting higher ambition on fossil fuel phase out. So these are the kinds of things that you'd be able to do. The press is also involved. If you're a journalist, you get a special badge to enter, and you'd be able to help document the process, interview folks. And then finally, corporations are also involved to a limited extent. It's very difficult for corporations to enter such United Nations conferences because they have a whole separate process of being accredited by the United Nations. So after explaining what different organizations do within the realm of international climate policy, the second thing is, how do I then get into international climate policy? If you're someone who loves the environment but may not have as much understanding of the global frameworks surrounding the UN and other climate policy initiatives, my first bet would be to read your country's National Determined Contribution. And that is really a document that each country is required to submit to the Paris Agreement and outlines their plans to address climate change. There are other national documents that countries have to submit as well, but the NDC is the first great start to it. The second thing I would do was also read COP decision text. So last year there was not a decision text, but there was this thing called the global stocktake. Anything that has like just the main summary of what happened at COP will give you a good understanding of, where things landed and how things are going. But these might give you an understanding of like, this is what happened. But I think another important part of policy is understanding why things happen in such a way, like why perhaps country A was very upset with this and country B was very upset with this. And that's why there's that tension. And ultimately we reached this kind of language because it was a compromise for something. And so one way to understand that kind of involvement is to read newsletters that track those kinds of negotiations. I really like IISD. So IISD is an organization that, gives daily bulletins during these like negotiation streams, so you can follow throughout the time, even if you're not at a UN conference. Climate Action Network is a great place to look at, and you can also join their like newsletters, I think, to get updates. I also highly recommend reading WRI's website. They have a ton of resources that explain very thoroughly, concisely, and accurately how the state of international policy is going, where it's planning to, what are the implications of certain policies, and what is needed to be done to move forward or get better standards. After gaining some knowledge and understanding that, I think the next thing is to get involved somehow, whether that's perhaps through Climate Action Network or through other networks within your community. There are things called Youngo, which is like a community for youth that try to enter UN conferences, or some countries such as Singapore send a youth delegation that you can apply for. I've met many youth delegates this year, and they have the time to help the pavilion, which is like where you run events, but they also get some time to learn from negotiators, meet the people that are there. And the third thing is really to see if you can get some sort of internship with the associated government negotiating body, such as if you're in a State Department, a lot of times they have internship experiences for about 6 months, for students as an example, and otherwise you have to go through USA Jobs as an example. Another thing I'd like to note is that you should try to find out who your negotiators are for the specific kind of substreams that you're most interested in, because let's say this is the negotiator from your country. Sometimes there are job postings that they will post on their personal LinkedIns, and then you can apply that way. So I know for State Department as an example, if you apply through just general postings that you see on LinkedIn by following some of these negotiators, that's another way to get in, because sometimes it's not necessarily always shown on USA Jobs. I also forgot to mention probably the most obvious kind of occupation to have, which is to work for the UNFCCC Secretariat themselves. They are based in Bonn, Germany, and a lot of their work is trying to get these countries together, doing a lot of that facilitating, I would say, and a lot of the technical capacity building work. So that's another way to get in. I'd recommend going through their internship route, applying through their website, and trying to see how you can get them from there. Another way is to try to go through your academic institution. So at Cornell, I was very lucky to be able to attend COP because we had a certain number of badges and projects to help certain government bodies. At the time, I was assisting the Zambian Ministry of Agriculture. There was an agricultural negotiation stream in which I followed. So there are a lot of ways in which you can get involved, but seeing what's available within your local community is probably the best bet. All of these are great ways to gain experience. So, you may not get a full-time job right off the bat, but it'd be a great way for you to first understand like the networks, see what kind of work is meant to be done, see if you like it, and that kind of thing. I personally got my job by cold applying. One thing I would recommend is to just search the words like international climate policy, UN frameworks, etc. to see on LinkedIn or green job callers on Instagram to see how you can find these kinds of positions. One other option for you is if you don't get it right away, work at whatever job you have. Work for an organization that you love and you know that has some sort of involvement, and ask to be involved in some way in terms of logistical management first. Get into those meetings, learn more of what you could do to help the organization better themselves, and propose that to them so that you could probably shift into that space. So I hope that was really useful for you. The last question that I really get from folks is like, what does your day-to-day job look like? I think a lot of people focus international climate policy on a conference, but there's actually a lot of things that happen year-round. While COP is 2 weeks nearing the end of the year, there are always workshops depending on the negotiating stream that you attend or work for that happen throughout the year. So as an example, I follow adaptation. There is a particular negotiating stream on adaptation that requires technical submissions, requires input, and there's a lot of planning that we work with governments to help create new planning documents or update them. So that's what we do throughout the year. So those are my tips and a brief overview on what international climate policy is. If you liked it, please subscribe. I really appreciate it. And I hope to see you soon another time. Bye.